Why does life feel meaningless? I think we all feel it sometimes, and maybe if not all, at least most of us. And I think the kind of people who would watch this channel feel it because the intellectually or philosophically inclined seem particularly prone to nihilism. That, by the way, is the technical term for the view that there is no meaning or value in life. Nihilism. I used to be prone to nihilistic thinking. It's certainly gotten better for me. And only recently, though, have I been able to make any progress in thinking about why I felt that life was meaningless. So that's what I want to talk about today. I think I've identified 3 sources of nihilism. They aren't philosophical arguments, but more like social conditions that lead us to think that life is meaningless. And I call those the death of God, the loss of a common narrative, and the rise of bullshit. So that's what I want to talk about today. Why we think life is meaningless and what we can do about it. We can't really talk about the meaning of life, or particularly the meaninglessness of life, without talking about God. For many of us, especially those of us who are of a religious persuasion, the existence of God is a source of meaning in our lives. The idea is that the universe is created, and it's created with a kind of intention or a plan behind it. And we can find meaning by understanding our place in that wider plan. And we can even try to increase the meaning in our lives by acting in accordance with that plan. This is a very old way of thinking about meaning in life. Some contemporary philosophers who have talked about this call this a supernaturalist view of the meaning of life. Because I am a Christian, I would probably want to describe the meaning of life in Christian terms. But you actually don't need to be a Christian to have this kind of view of the meaning of life. It's actually older than Christianity. Marcus Aurelius was not a Christian. He was a Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor. And he took a lot of comfort in the fact that he thought the universe had a kind of rational will behind it. Marcus actually inherited this idea from earlier Greek philosophers, and we can use an old Greek term for this. We're going to call that the logos. The oldest use of that term seems to be from Heraclitus, though we don't actually know what Heraclitus meant by logos because all of his existing works are so fragmentary. The notion of the logos, though, was taken up by many different philosophers. Aristotle used the term, I think Plato used the term, and it was certainly used by the Stoics to describe the rational will of the universe. And for someone like Marcus Aurelius or the other Stoics, the idea of finding some kind of comfort or meaning in your life could be put in terms of living in accord with the rational will of the universe. So one reason we might think that life is meaningless is if we don't have this conception of the universe. And increasingly, we don't. We have inherited a highly mechanistic view of the world in which things just kind of happen. They happen in accordance with laws of nature, which are just descriptions of causal processes. We think of the world in terms of causation, of cause and effect, and not in terms of purpose or teleology. If we don't think of ourselves as occupying a universe with a greater purpose, then we can't make sense of our own lives by aligning with that greater purpose. There's simply nothing for us to align to. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead," and this is actually not really a statement of atheism per se. Instead, Nietzsche is saying that the whole of the religious worldview has become unbelievable. But he acknowledged that so much of what we believed about the world was built up on this worldview, and he thought all of it was going to collapse. And this included our understandings of morality and our understandings of meaning. I do think that a rise of atheism and a collapse of a teleological conception of the world have increased nihilism. Now, that is not to say that some philosophers have argued that you can still have a meaningful life if there is no God, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So it does seem like atheism, while not strictly entailing a nihilistic worldview, might contribute to why some people are prone to nihilism. And I say this merely as a description, not even as a criticism of atheism. Now, there are many philosophers who have argued that atheism is perfectly compatible with a view in which life has meaning. So let's talk about some of those other sources of meaning and how they seem to be fading in the modern world. And that's why I want to talk about the loss of a common narrative. If we don't think that there is a God or a single purpose to the universe, we still might believe that there are many different sources of value in the world. And many of the times, what we're going to do is look for a narrative by which we can understand and interpret the world. In general, I like to think of human beings as storytellers. We are piecing together facts and events, and we are trying to actually craft them into a narrative, rather than just merely reporting those facts back. We want to give an interpretation of those events, and we want to give them some kind of meaning. Having a narrative actually allows us to interpret new facts and to just make sense of the world. So perhaps we could find meaning by looking at those different narratives. The pursuit of scientific knowledge could be one such. We can see ourselves as bold truth seekers who are trying to fight ignorance and uncertainty. Some of us might also turn to political ideologies, and we want to understand ourselves as people who are struggling for justice or for liberty or for whatever political value we deem best. And conflict is another source of meaning for us. The Cold War gave an interpretation of the world to both the United States and to the Soviet Union because we could understand ourselves as engaged in an existential battle. So various events had meaning insofar as they contributed to this battle. And we could talk about how all of this fed into either a pursuit of liberty and the Western way or of communism as an alternative to capitalism. But the US won the Cold War pretty handily. And after that, there's no threat. There's no other. And it's really hard to tell a good story when you don't have an enemy or a bad guy. In the 20th and 21st century, all of this started to fray. We have what I would call meaning-making institutions, universities, media, governments, community groups, and affiliation or trust in them has steadily declined. In general, we live in a more individualistic world, and because we live in a more individualistic world, we are more prone to not buy into those common narratives. Since we don't have those common narratives, we don't have an easy way to interpret our lives or the events that we encounter, and thus, we start to think maybe there is no interpretation or maybe there is no meaning. So some of us then might look for individual narratives to tell about ourselves. And so maybe if we can't find meaning in a communal or shared narrative, we can at least find meaning in our individual narratives. Many of us do this, but also for many of us, no such narrative is forthcoming. We don't really understand ourselves as making progress in the world, and a narrative without progress is a rather bad narrative, and there's no reason really for us to buy into it. We don't understand ourselves as striving for anything. We don't understand ourselves either as being able to better our stations or to find our way in the world. And there's always this nagging feeling. When you choose to find your own narrative and to maybe make your own meaning in life, there's always this question, why should I make meaning this way and not that? And we start to wonder, maybe all of it is pointless. And so what else are we left with? Well, the third factor that I think has really increased the sense of nihilism in the modern era is the rise of what I'm calling bullshit. And I'd like to apologize. I don't like to swear on this channel, but really this is the best phrase for the job. In 2005, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt published a book called On Bullshit, and he was mostly concerned with speech. It is a great little book, by the way. It's one of the few modern philosophy bestsellers, and you could read it in an afternoon. It is really good. Frankfurt tries to offer a definition of bullshit speech, and he ends up saying that bullshit is speech which is trying to persuade you, but isn't concerned with the truth. So the bullshitter is someone who wants you to agree with them, but doesn't care if what they believe is true or if they're offering good reasons for you actually to believe what they believe. I would actually expand this definition. I would say that bullshit isn't just a speech that isn't concerned with the truth. I would also want to say that bullshit is speech which might be true, but is pointless. There's just no reason for us to be saying it. Well, that's bullshit speech, but I also want to talk about bullshit jobs. So the anthropologist David Graeber wrote an essay called On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs, and then he published a book just called Bullshit Jobs in 2018. It too, by the way, is a very good book. Graeber discusses bullshit jobs as jobs which are utterly pointless, which have no real value, but we have to pretend like they value in order to keep them. And an increasing portion of modern work is a bullshit job. Importantly for Graeber, bullshit jobs aren't things like hairdressers, which are low-paid jobs, or people who work at a McDonald's. Those actually are meaningful. They feed people. They make people happy. But Graeber instead is thinking about those jobs which make no one better off and which really don't serve any kind of social utility. Now, strictly speaking, Frankfurt and Graeber are talking about different things. Frankfurt is concerned with speech, Graeber is concerned with work. But I think they've both kind of caught on to a larger phenomenon and have just described an aspect of it. The point of speaking and of arguing is to search for the truth. So bullshit speech, or the bullshitter, is someone who is speaking but has given up on the point or purpose of speech. Similarly, the point of work is to be productive, to be creative, to actually make something, or to provide some kind of utility. And a bullshit job is one which has no purpose. There is no utility. There is no production. In both cases, these are things that we spend much of our time doing, speaking and working, and they have been robbed of any greater sense of purpose. The media you consume is likely bullshit. Political media, for instance, mostly just wants to make you mad, and they don't care about actually rationally persuading you. And many of the jobs that we consider to be lucrative in the fact that they pay well are in fact bullshit jobs. And so those of us who maybe have an education or have certain kinds of skills are actually incentivized to go and do bullshit jobs rather than to do jobs which could be a source of meaning for us. So as both of these proliferate, bullshit just starts to proliferate in general, and we are surrounded by it. We feel like we're drowning in it, and that is a source of despair. I think about this, by the way, every time I go and put gas in my car. There are these little television screens that they've put on gas pumps. And I already don't like having to drive a car everywhere, so I already don't like having to go and put gas in my car. But then when I go to put gas in my car, it starts to play entertainment news. Now, I purposely and consciously try to limit the kind of media that I consume because I don't want to fill my mind with bullshit. But now, as I'm doing something I wish I didn't have to do, which is put gas in my car, I am essentially forced to listen to bullshit that I didn't want to hear in the first place. There's just no escape, and it makes my heart ache. That's a small example, but it's just the one that always comes to mind when I talk about these topics. So those are 3 possible sources of nihilism. That is not an exhaustive list, and it's not like you couldn't quibble with some of them. But there does seem to be something about each of these which can contribute to our nihilistic moment. So now let's ask ourselves, what can we do about it? The worry that I have about offering any advice is that I'm a philosopher, and that primarily philosophers are good at assessing arguments. The problem is I don't think most of us are prone to nihilism because we've been rationally persuaded. And if you haven't reasoned yourself into a conclusion, it is very difficult to reason yourself out of that conclusion. I've primarily been describing social conditions, a shift in worldview and how we view the universe, a breakdown in trust in institutions which help provide us with narratives by which we can interpret the world, and the rise of bullshit speech and work. Those aren't arguments, and so I can't refute them and thus make you not a nihilist anymore. And I also just can't give you all the reasons. Now, I have to admit that I found meaning mostly by embedding myself in a religious tradition. So as an Orthodox Christian, I kind of have a narrative in the world. I have a community that I can rely upon, and I have a way of viewing the world which kind of saves me from nihilism. But I know that answer isn't satisfying for everyone. 1, there are people who are not interested in religion, and I'm not here to convert you. And 2, there are people who earnestly go looking for meaning in religion and just don't seem to find it. So what else could they do? I only have 2 pieces of advice. The first one is to just go and avoid bullshit. One of the ways that we can do this is by trying to strictly limit the media that you consume, and this might mean, by the way, that you need to turn off YouTube. I say this as a YouTuber. I know there's an irony here, but you might need to do it. Being surrounded by bullshit speech just tends to lead to despair, and it leads to a lack of clarity in your thought where all of those negative, nihilistic feelings can really start to kind of fester. And we also probably need to avoid bullshit work. If you are not working a job that you consider meaningful or at least socially useful, try to find something else. It might pay less, it might be longer hours, but at least it can give you some way of feeling useful for others. The best kind of work really is creative work. And I don't mean work that participates in what we call the creative economy. I mean work that actually creates something. So someone who cooks a good meal is being creative. Someone who even helps raise children is being creative because they are helping to build up these children and their lives. A construction worker is being creative. So there are many different options for finding creative work. And maybe that's going to lead you to feel useful and also to feel like there's something meaningful out in the universe. When I have found a way to make myself useful in my own work, that's when I have been able to find some satisfaction. My second piece of advice is to go and search for beautiful things. If nihilism is true, there is nothing that is objectively beautiful in the world. There is no source of objective value or beauty. And yet, when I encounter truly beautiful things, I find it almost impossible to sustain my nihilistic tendencies because I look at a beautiful painting or a beautiful vista or landscape and think, that just is beautiful. It's not beautiful because I have imparted a feeling of beauty on it. Now, maybe I'm deluding myself, but honestly, I am unable to sustain a nihilistic way of thinking when I am encountering beauty. If you need to find some beautiful things, maybe you could read some books. I often talk about books on this channel, so let me make 3 suggestions, which I call the 3 Ds. Dante, Dickinson, and Dostoevsky. All 3 of these writers have a sense of beauty to them, and they will help you find something in the world. But maybe books aren't going to be it for you. I would say experiment and explore, but just seek out beauty. Break out of the banality of the day-to-day life and try to encounter something extraordinary. Now, I'm not sure that either of these really are enough. This is the kind of work that I'm only just beginning, and I'm only really starting to think through these in a serious way. If you have thoughts, I would love to hear them down below. And I would also love to hear, your experiences with encountering nihilism or trying to get over it.